thing, right? Tell me when I can go share my screen and I will do
I
it.
will, but I'm going to introduce you again
Oh
because we
no.
deleted the first one. So,
Oh.
once again, I'm introducing bassist from the orchestra and violin maker Bob Spear, who will be talking about the history of the violin family and the orchestra. Bob, let me put the spotlight back on you. Let me make you a co-host to make sure you can share.
Okay.
All right, and now try again.
What could possibly go wrong?
Your screen sharing. Oh, there it
I
is. It's
have
not full
I
screen
have
yet.
my cursor now.
Whatever you did the
Okay,
last time to make it. There it is. There it is.
there it is. All righty. Okay, well, I guess before I start, very first thing I want to do is to thank Aaron and to thank Julia for a whole lot of hand-holding and working through technical difficulties, which I seem to attract like a magnet attracts iron filings. I've never gone through anything like this before, but here we go, for better or for worse. But thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. On the screen, if all is working, you'll see there's the history of the violin family and the orchestra, how the violin family works acoustically, and the third one, how the violin family is constructed. Now, each of these are, I consider them separate topics. And when Madeline told me we were going to continue these meetings probably through the summer, I volunteered to do a few more since Aaron and Madeline have been doing most of the heavy lifting with these presentations. So as I thought about it, how the violin family is constructed is directly influenced by how they work acoustically and also by their history and what they were used for. So that's what I'm going to start with tonight. And I guess I will go through this, hope nothing goes astray. And if we have time at the end, thank you, Julia. We have time at the end, maybe for question and answer. We'll see how that goes. So away we go. I guess the first thing I like to look at, since I always like to start from ground zero, is what were the possible predecessors of the violin. And you see here on the screen, there's a picture. It's a bass gamba. And that's what I think most of us think of when we think about the instrument that the violin came from, because the gamba family is a little bit older than the violin family. But most historians say no, that they're completely separate instruments and philosophies, although from a practical standpoint as a violin maker, they share a lot of common techniques in their construction. So also some of the plucked instruments, you wouldn't think so, but lute and guitar, also many of the ways that those instruments are constructed found their way into violin construction as well. And for the bowed ones, bowed predecessors, we have the viol, the rebec, the lira da braccio, and the da gamba family, which we just talked about. And most historians agree that, or they think that the violin came from the Arabian rebec, which is the little instrument, three-stringed instrument that you see there on the left. While you take a quick glance at that, notice the bow. A little bit later, but it has some characteristics, but it's the widest where you bow it, so it's really ergonomically not well suited to be a violin. I have another theory, which is just a theory, but you see on the right, there's two pictures there of a figure, and I was unable to find attributions for this graphic, but they're both playing the same instrument. It's called a vihuela. It's a Spanish guitar, and it came in two formats: the vihuela da mano, which was played like a guitar, and that would be the one on the left, and the vihuela de arco, which was played with a bow, and that'll be the one on the right. And if you look real closely at the one on the right, you'll see the bow there, very similar to the rebec bow, because I think both of these instruments came through Spain before the instrument building era began. The da mano, the plucked one, played like a guitar on the left. My weary old eyes seem to think they see 5 strings on that instrument, but I'm not sure. But on the left, it's definitely a 4-stringed instrument, and it's held in the hand down position. And what looks like the beginnings of a scroll, you'll see it's pointed at the floor. This instrument had a bridge like a guitar, so the strings were very flat, and that, of course, presented problems when you wanted to play it with the bow. So on the one on the right, you can see in the center there, you can see the beginning of center bouts. It looks sort of like a double scroll or double geometric figure there, but at the beginning, they are starting to recess the center of the instrument to make clearance for the bow. And this instrument, the bow was slack, and the player played it by bowing all the strings at once, because it was still basically a guitar, and you could play chords that way. Then a little bit later on, someone got the idea to arch the bridge slightly so that it was very slightly rounded. And by using a slack bow, the player, you can wrap the hair of the bow around your first finger or your thumb, however it works for you. And if you play it slack, you'll play all the strings at once. But if you tighten it up, you can actually pick out individual strings. And my understanding of this instrument is the way it was played, this sort of was a drone sort of in chordal arrangement on the bottom strings, which were all played open or fingered or stopped, but the actual melody could be played on the top string. So that was how this instrument was performing, how you played it rather, and I think it has a lot to do with how our own modern violin evolved, which I will get to in a minute. It's hard to say who actually invented the violin, but we do know that the violin appears about 1535, roughly said. And we also know that the first center of violin making was in, well, it wasn't called Italy at the time, but it's on the Italian peninsula. And if you look at the map, the big map, and this is a modern map since it shows the A4 motorway, which I don't think was there 500 or 600 years ago, but you'll see way down at the bottom towards the center is the little Italian city of Cremona. Very, very famous city in the history of the violin. And just to the north of that, you'll see up a little bit above that, the city of Brescia, which was larger than Cremona. And at the time, it had a better road network than Cremona did. And off to the right there, you'll see you can see the whole of Italy with the boot and all that. Right now on my screen, you're all covered, that's covered. But you see Lombardy is in maroon, and it's up in the northern part of Italy. And what makes it interesting, of course, is why in this little out of the way place, all of a sudden this great explosion of musical instrument making, because at the time, both Brescia and Cremona were famous and had a very active musical instrument scene. And what I found out, I thought this is just interesting. I don't know how truthful it is, but there's a lot of force behind it. Violin, as I said, appears in roughly 1535, and the makers came from, they might have been just there and decided all one morning they were going to make something that looked like a violin. But not many years before that, in Spain, in the year which you probably all know from your elementary school history lessons, the year 1492, that's when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And he sailed the ocean blue because the 700 Years' War had ended. The Catholic majesties of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, had defeated the Moors at the Alhambra, which was the last stronghold. And then they booted everyone out of Spain who was not willing to convert to Catholicism. And I don't have a world map here to show you, but if you look at Lombardy in Spain, you'll see that it's very easy by ship to reach there. And if you were going on foot over land, it's practically a straight line. So I think that a lot of these people coming up from Spain might have gone to the northern part of Italy because, first of all, the climate's the same. And second of all, the languages, Spanish and Italian, are very close. So they went there also because the southern part of Italy was controlled by the Spain. And it was the era of two popes. There was a southern pope and a northern pope. And the northern pope would be the one who was in the area of where Lombardy was. And the southern pope was a Borgia. And nobody wanted to be down there with those guys. I think they came up here. And the reason I think that is that the vihuela, many people say it's just a very, very short step from vihuela to viola. And so there was a tradition already started. And when I did research on the history of the violin, which I have been doing for years, several of the terms of measurement that were used in Cremona and Brescia are actually Spanish. They sound similar to the Italian, but they're not. So it kind of makes me think there was a strong Spanish influence. But the most important thing about the violin, and this is while I'm chatting away here, look at the picture on the right of the violin. This is a violin, very early violin by Andrea Amati, built in 1559. It may be the oldest violin that we have. It's in a museum now. Obviously, it's on a display case. But just look at that for a moment and see if there's anything about it that's unusual that might catch your eye. I'm not going to talk too much about Brescia, although it was a very important center, and you'll become clear why this is as I go on. But the first major Italian violin maker, the one that started the entire Cremonese dynasty, was Andrea Amati. You see his dates up there. So he would be just 1535 would be just about perfect age for him. And the thing about the instruments, if you looked at this violin and you say, I don't really see anything about it that's unusual, that's because there is nothing unusual about it. The instrument just appears in history fully formed, thoroughly worked out, beautifully proportioned, and it hasn't changed since. Not very much. I mean, Stradivari adds a few tweaks in the corners, and people do different things with the F-holes and the sizes and change very, very slightly, but the instrument just shows up. And it's a wonderful exercise in geometric design. If I do another one on the construction of the violin, I'll do the geometric design process for you. It's absolutely, absolutely wonderful. So we have the violin up here, and I don't know if you are interested in studying history or not, but there's been this long, persistent story about how the poor, pitiful violin was played in dance halls and taverns and so forth because it was loud and shrill while the nobility favored the gambas. And to a certain extent, some people did favor the gambas, but the violin on the screen by Andrea Amati, 1559, was built for Philip II of Spain. And he wanted an instrument made of the finest materials, like that of a lute, but simple to play. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to that particular instrument, but this one has survived. And also the Amati family, distantly related to the Medici. Medici were great patrons of the art in Renaissance Italy. And he was given a commission, Andrea Amati, for a very substantial order for Charles IX of France. And so that pretty much puts to rest this thing that who bought these instruments and what kind of bars were they played in. They were in all the noble courts and all over, northern Italy, and then working outward, you start to see them especially in France. So the Amati family right now, there's only is Andrea just whacking out fiddles left and right as far as we know. And later on, his two sons join him. And their names are Antonio and Hieronymus, if I say it correctly. And there's kind of a contest going on at this point between the makers of Cremona, who are few in number, but producing very elegant instruments, and the makers in Brescia, who are more numerous. And they're making more instruments for commercial trade and distribution. So you don't see until afterwards the elegance of this instrument start to appear in Brescia as well. Here, this is a page from a very famous series of books by Michael Pretorius, who was a composer and musician. And he wanted to write a series of 4 volumes, which he entitled Syntagma Musicum, published in Wolfenbüttel in 1609. Well, this one was, he had in mind no less than writing a book in which every instrument, every musical practice, every style of music that had ever existed up to that point would be represented in this book. And he figured it would take him 4 volumes. And unfortunately, he died before the 4th one was finished, but he did manage to get to, this one is, I think, volume 2, just called De Organum. And these pictures are made by very skilled artisans, woodcutters. These are woodcuts, so the woodcutter has to make them, has to cut them inverted. They're like a negative, so that when the woodcuts are pressed on paper, they turn out looking right. I think that's just amazing. But I wanted to show this because, see on the left, this is the gamba family. You see little numbers by them, 1, 2, 3. See the one off there on the right, it looks like a Z. That's the way they did 2 back in that day. And number 4, they're all gambas. And they're all very, very consistent. You'll see that they all have 6 strings, they all have frets. If you look at the bows, they're all basically the same. Number 5 there in the middle is Italian style Lira di Braccio, which has a very violin-like shape, but the top, at the head of it, the headstock is very much like a guitar. And it was a popular instrument for a while, but it has not really survived. Here in the right-hand one, we get to the more modern family. They look like violins, and they are not yet fully formed. Up at the top is a small pochette, which is a dancing master's fiddle. And then number 2 is the violin, an octave higher. Number 3 is discant violin, a 4th higher. So that would be like up an octave above the viola. Number 4 is the discant violin, which in German they've marked it rechte, or means the right or proper one. Number 5 is a tenor violin. Number 6 is the bass. And the long, skinny ones in the middle are various incarnations of an instrument based on the monochord. They're, believe it or not, the one in the center is almost 6 feet long. If you've ever heard of the term tromba marina, certainly one of the strangest instruments ever invented. That's what it would look like with 4 strings. And we're fortunate, if you notice on the bottom of the picture, there's a ruler on each one, and this ruler is marked out in Brunswick inches, which is a little bit smaller than the inch we use today. So we have a real good idea of what these sizes, these instruments actually were. And it's totally amazing how close they are to the instruments of today. So either they did very, very well right from the beginning, or we have not been able to do better. Now, Italian is a great language for diminutives, as any musician knows, or if you look at a score and it's P, it's piano, which means soft. Well, if you want to make it softer than soft, it's pianissimo. And if it's softer than softer, then it's pianissimo, and up so on to 4 or 5 pianissimos. So the Italians have this wonderful way of describing their instruments, which, as interesting as it is, can be confusing to us sometimes. But I just wanted you to take a look at this on the left there, the list of instruments which were more or less in use at the time may have all been called viols or viols. And the instrument makers that I mentioned in Brescia, from the literature they left us, they called it Violn with no I in the middle, so it was violon. But if you were looking at the word viol as the way where your starting point is, violin would be the smaller viol. And if you wanted to say an instrument that was smaller still, it would be violino. Then you go up to the middle voice instruments, you see the viola, which is again another term that distinguishes it definitively from the smaller instruments. And then if they have a viola that played more than one part or more than one role in a musical ensemble, they just simply say, this instrument plays the alto line, so it's the viola alto. And this instrument plays the tenor line, so it's the viola tenore. The basses are a little bit different. Violon, which is the last one on the list, the ona means big. This is a big, big instrument. And if you look at, if you have a score to the Bach, the Brandenburg that we're playing, you'll see that he writes for the violon, which is the cello, and the violone grosso, which is this, I guess, analogous to the contrabass. And how that C in violoncello snuck in there, I'm not sure, but the word ello is the word that is modifying viol. So if you had violon and then ello, you'd have too many E's in the middle, I suppose. And so it became violoncello, and gradually we just dropped the violon part altogether, and we just call it the cello. Okay, we're going to go back and talk just a wee bit more about the Amati family, because they were working from this point in time where there were not much precedent for the violin, and they were actively refining and developing it. Here on the right, you see a picture of a double bass by Hieronymus II Amati. He's the grandson of the first Hieronymus. It's got a label in it dated 1680, but the experts say it's really made by Nicola Amati in 1670, because he was still alive at the time. And it's worth mentioning here because of the multitude of instruments that were made. You almost never see double basses coming out of Cremona. They pretty much made violins, violas, cellos. They made guitars, and they made mandolins. And in Brescia, you were more likely to find the bigger instruments, especially the basses and so forth. But the Amatis were industriously working and making the violin go into different sizes, and they were trying all kinds of interesting things with it. And then something happens in 1629 to 1631, which has a kind of a profound impact on the history, not just of the violin, but of all the ensembles that the violin is used for. And they had a pandemic of the bubonic plague in 1629. And what they did, sound familiar, they distanced people if they could leave town and go into the hinterlands or up into the mountains. They knew they were safer there, so they did that. And they got through 1629 pretty well. Then 1630 came along, and there was a big feast day. And the citizens of Cremona were very upset that they were not going to be allowed to gather for the feast. So the city fathers, or whoever were the controlling authorities, relented and allowed them to gather. And within weeks afterwards, the plague was roaring through the north of Italy. This sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? All these people, oh, you don't need to wear your masks. Oh, don't need to distance. It's going away. But the thing that makes it of peculiar interest is that plague was so severe and it killed so many people, it literally wiped out every last violin maker in Brescia and all of the violin makers in Italy, except Niccolò Amati. Whole families, whole dynasties, everything just gone to the grave from this horrible pandemic. And he was pretty young. He was probably about 30, 35 years old at the time. And he had a terrible decision to make. He was the last violin maker in Italy. And he could say, well, okay, I'm just going to be very busy for the rest of my life and I'll make a lot of money. Because at the time, violin making, like many of the finer arts, was very closely held by the families. So the children followed their father into the workshop, and then their children would come. Gradually, the workshop would grow in that respect, but they didn't take apprentices. They didn't have a guild system at the time. And so Nicola had to make a decision whether to just continue as being the only violin maker in Italy or to break with tradition and take apprentices, which he decided, fortunately for us, to take apprentices. And he trained some very, very famous ones. This Stradivari is supposed to have studied in his shop, and early members of the Guarneri family, if you're familiar with the great Italian violin makers, all either studied with him directly or were influenced by his work and his models and his design. So he saves the violin. He saves the whole tradition of music. And I always never believed that it was that close. Okay, I am skipping on a little bit. It's a very deep topic. I can't cover everything. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the number and proliferation of instruments that was around during the Renaissance, or what they call the Age of Enlightenment in Italy. We have the violin of fourth higher. We have violins in large sizes, violins in small sizes. We have grand pattern violins. We have violins octave. Most of the higher instruments are, of course, limited by the state of string technology at the time. In the middle voices, we have the alto viola and the tenor viola. I probably should explain a little bit about those instruments. They were both alto clef instruments, and they were both tuned alike. The alto was a small instrument. It was meant to be played on the shoulder, as we do today. The tenor was much larger, and it was generally played with the hand down, like in that picture of the vihuela at the beginning. The instrument was rested against the chest rather than on the shoulder. And it had, just as it happens, the tenor voice of the human voice is covered by the range of the tenor viola, but it's very confusing to think of a tenor alto. And that's because music of the time was written a lot in open score. The composer wouldn't necessarily specify, I want a viola to play this part, and I want a sackbut to play that part. They would just say, here's the range of notes, whatever instrument can play it is a tenor, if it's in the tenor voice, or is an alto. So these two instruments coexisted for a while, the large and the small violas. And then down a little bit deeper voices, we have the tenor violin, which is an octave below the violin. The violoncello piccolo, which was very similar to that little five-stringed, Julia is smiling at the word piccolo. It's very close to the five-string instrument that you saw in the Pretorius woodcut. And then the big violoncello, which basically by this time there were other centers of instrument making, and the Venetians were famous for their they were cellos, they were very big, very deep ribs. And if you're a cellist and you know of the Cervé Stradivari cello, that's a Venetian model cello. It's just huge, deep ribs. It's a fantastic instrument. And in the bass section, we have all kinds of things, the contrabbasso di gamba, the violone grosso. And then we have smaller instruments, the G violon, which would be in our modern orchestra, if it existed, it would be the instrument between the double bass and the cello. its low note would be G, which obviously why they call it the G violon. And also large basses were made in the gamba family and the violon family, and then later in the violin family itself. So these were similar but distinctly different. And the reason I've listed them out this way, you notice all those nifty arrows pointing off to the right. All these instruments died out except the ones that you see in the second column. The violin of fourth higher, the octave violins, small, large model violins. We have just one violin now. It's a standard model. I mean, we have slight variations. And I'm not including children's violins, student or fractional size violins in this list. The viola we have left is just the alto. The tenor disappears. Likewise, the tenor violin disappears. The piccolo violin, violoncello, the big Venetian cellos all disappear. And if you're a cellist today in a modern orchestra, chances are about 95% that you're playing a B form violoncello, which was one of the refined designs of Stradivari, because as time went on, these big instruments kept getting smaller. And all the basses are pretty much down to one, you just call it double bass or a contrabass. And that's, I have to say, just as an aside, the instruments are standardizing. Here is what you see, except for the double bass, which I would have to say, as far as the family goes, it's the only instrument that's totally out of control. They were built in dozens of sizes, and we have the recorded verifications that they came in over 40 different tunings. So you had to be really, really brave to pick up the bass. So why did all this dying out take place? Where did all these instruments go? What happened to our violin family? And how is it that the string family is the only family in the whole musical world that does not have a tenor voice anymore? It really is, Grove's dictionary says it's inconceivable, but yet it happened. So if I were writing a book about it, I would call what happened a perfect storm, but I think somebody else already beat me to that. What's going on through the Dark and Middle Ages and into the Age of Enlightenment, we have a general decline of the influence of the church, which was the great patron of the arts. I mean, look at the cathedrals that they built and so forth, but anything in there, the sculptures, the paintings, the musical performances, all that was paid for by the church. And the church had a tremendous influence on the way music was written. They used, it was very much polyphonic, very thickly textured with the lower or middle voices, the cantus firmus, really holding the melody down. But at the same time, we have enlightened monarchies rising up all over Europe. And these guys wanted to be, they have this thing where they just had to outdo one another. So they were very, very interested in having massive, wonderful orchestras, things that other enlightened monarchs didn't have. So pretty soon you have not only Italian violins all over Europe, you have Italian violinists as well, because they were considered the best. And I guess the most notable of these would be, there's a very famous group called the 24 Violins of the King. That was King Charles's group, King Charles IX of France. He was only really a child when he ordered that group of instruments. His mother, who was Catherine de' Medici, was actually the one who did that. A great lover of the arts, great patron of the arts. And I also want to say that this doesn't happen sequentially. The church rises, it declines. Then the monarchies rise, and then they decline. This all takes place, it's all intermixed. There's kind of a rising and falling. But over time, you see the general pattern that the middle class begins to rise. And here's where the interesting pressures come that led to the reduction of the family. The middle class people wanted to show that they were also capable of having wonderful musical organizations, but they certainly could not afford 24 violins in a house with, mother, a father, and maybe 3 or 4 children. So they, you might typically find a keyboard player, maybe one of the children would play the violin, maybe another would play the cello. You see the decline of polyphony because groups were too small for polyphonic writing. And you see what happens is not only the rise of the stile galant, which becomes the classical era of Haydn and Mozart, but the trio, very, very popular. Composers wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them and sold them to make money from the middle class, which they had not been able to do when the church was in control. And if an instrument was large or difficult to play, or it was too expensive, and they didn't use it, it didn't bother them if a voice was missing, because the use of figured bass rises here at the same time. And the continuo instrument is usually, well, first it was probably a lute, and then it was a harpsichord, and any note that was missing could be filled in by the continuo. In fact, they got very expert at that. And the composers would even write little numbers on the bottom of the bass line so that the continuo player could understand which notes were to be filled in that were not missing. So over a period of time, we have really a very starved string family, whereas before it was very, very rich. Here on the right-hand side of the screen is one of the instruments we lost, the Stradivari tenor viola, made of a set of instruments that he made. And it comes to us in almost perfect condition. It has really virtually as it left the maker's bench. The reason being that it was made late in Stradivari's life during this era where the middle class and trios were rising, and it was never played. It was probably just put in a closet somewhere, and there are very, very few like it. So it's very good in that respect, but it's actually kind of a tragedy that, well, like we just got such a small, starved string world right now. We'll talk a little bit, just very quickly, about Haydn for reasons that will become painfully obvious here in a moment. And only about his time at a place called Wienzerl, which was the summer country estate of Baron Karl Joseph Fernberg. And Karl Joseph Fernberg was a great lover of music, and he hired Haydn, a very, very young composer at the time, not well known and just looking for a break. He invited him to come to Wienzerl for the summer and write music for the entertainment of the nobility. Well, there was only one problem with this. There were no musicians at Wienzerl. So it turns out that Baron Fernberg's steward was a string player. Aha, wonderful. Haydn himself was a violinist. Okay, so that's up to 2. Visiting that summer was a gentleman named Albrechtsberger, who was a cellist. And he's not the same, if you're a cellist, he's not the same Albrechtsberger who's the famous cello virtuoso, nor the one who was Beethoven's teacher, but somehow related. And then last of all, he found the parish priest is a string player as well. So we know that Albrechtsberger played cello and Haydn played violin. So that means the other two one was a violinist and one knew how to play the viola. So let me think. 2 violins, the viola, and a cello. What does that remind you of? A string quartet, no? Yes. Haydn writes string quartets because that's all the instruments that he has there to write for. And they're a great success, even though the early ones are really more like divertimenti. And see, he kept writing string quartets after that, and they became very, very popular. And later on, of course, he wrote symphonies. And his symphonies, the string sections of the symphony are basically string quartet with expanded sections and the addition of the contrabass. So that's why he's known as the father of the string quartet and the father of the orchestra. But underneath, I got mad at him when I read about this, because I see I've listed him as the destroyer of the viola and the savior of the viola. I was mad at him because he didn't write quintets like Boccherini did, his contemporary. Because if by not doing so, by limiting his group to one viola, he pretty much put the final nail in the coffin of the big tenor violas, which I think are an instrument we would love to have in today's modern orchestra. But on the other hand, he did specify an alto, and he really saved that instrument, because the alto, the viola was in decline at the time. And I have it written down here, but I'll just go off on my memory. If you look at the production of violas, and this is how you know what's going on musically, the Stradivari shop probably made 11 or 1,200 instruments, maybe more, in their many long years of operation, and probably somewhere around 250 or so of these are violins that we know about. And about 63 of them are cellos, no contrabasses, 4 or 5 guitars and a couple of mandolins, and 11 violas plus 1 tenor, which you just saw the picture of. That's the whole production of violas. And there was at the time in Rome, a German named David Techler, who worked for 40 years in Rome. We have a viola from him where he has written on the label, La Terza Viola, my third viola. He wrote in 40 years, and a lot of the other famous makers who came after Haydn made no violas at all. So it is pretty much an indication that the viola was just about written off. So I had to change my opinion of Papa Haydn and say, okay, you did a good job. Now we're going to leave him for a second. I'm going to jump back in time and talk a little bit about where the orchestra comes from. And this picture here is the picture of a Greek theatron. It means literally the seeing place. And you can see the circular seating there on the right-hand side. Theatron is where our word theater comes from. And this is called an amphitheater, which means around in Greek. So amphitheater also comes from the Greek. This large structure in the back, you see sort of like a remnants of a building, is called a skene in Greek. And it is the places where the actors got ready or changed costumes or did whatever they had to do. It's the skene is where our word scene comes from. And then down in the center there, you see this like a brown area. That's an extension of the stage. That's modern. That's just done for some special purpose. But what I wanted to point out was in the center, you see a half circle. In some of the other Greek theaters, it's a full circle. And that is the orchestra. That is, which means literally the dancing place. And this is where the famous Greek chorus sang and danced, and where the musicians were seated. So all that carries forth. Let me see. Yeah, this tradition continues in through Roman times, after the Romans defeated the Greeks in their large buildings where their legislatures met. Their center section was also called the orchestra. And there was a raised platform in the center where the speaker or the important person who would lead the meeting of the legislators that day, he stood on this raised stand. It was called a podium in Latin. So I said, let me see, orchestra, podium, leader of orchestra steps on podium. It began to sound very, very familiar to me. I have to say also, before I forget, I have to thank George Koppel, Joe, friend of mine, who he does the bow repairs for my shop, but in his younger days, he studied classical Greek and Latin languages in college, and he helped me with these, with some of these pronunciations. Here's one for you. Where is Philo's harmonica? Well, I won't make you stretch your minds for long. Philos in Greek means the sort of like amateur in the sense of being the lover of something or the student of something. And harmonica was the study of not just the harmonies of music, but also the theory, pretty much all about music. And this is where our word philharmonic comes from. And this word also has survived into the present. In fact, it gained a lot of credence in 18th century London, where musical societies were formed, and they were called philharmonic societies. And here in the United States, our own orchestra, like the New York Philharmonic, also started out as a society. So the Greeks, even though they didn't know anything about the violin or the modern acoustics of concert halls, any of that, really have had quite a huge impact and influence on us over the years. And this is a modern concert hall. I think it's called the First Union Hall. It's in Toronto. If you have a little trouble reading this, you see the yellow second balcony should be stacked on top of the red, which is the first balcony, and that goes on top of the part of the diagram that's measured in blue. And if you've ever been into our own State Theater in Ithaca, this is how our State Theater is pretty much laid out. But I posted this because the blue section is called the orchestra. In all the many, many concert halls, there is a whole entire section where the seats, and it's not so much because you're near the orchestra, it's that flat spot down at the center in the middle of the building, just like in the ancient Greek amphitheaters. Only now, because the audience sits there, the audience has become part of the orchestra as well, which I guess it just goes to show you how the meaning of words can change over the years. As far as the development of ensembles where the violin was played, and the words concert and consort, I did quite a bit of research about those. And the further back you go, the more confused they get. And many people say it may have actually once been the same word. But in our modern times, consort generally means a group of like instruments. And a broken consort would be a group of dissimilar instruments. Now, the 24 violins of the king, at the time, we would call it a string orchestra, but at the time it was considered a consort. That phrase of calling the musicians the orchestra yet hadn't really taken hold, because the composition of these groups was very, very loose. It just, as I mentioned before, whatever instrument you had at hand that could cover the part played in the group. So this goes on until about 1700 or something, 1702. It's very early in the 1700s for Monteverdi's Orfeo. And Monteverdi had very definite ideas about the instruments he wanted to be played in his group. And on his scores, he specifies. He's one of the very, very first who does that. And it just goes on from that point. And you see into Haydn's orchestra. By then, even the early Haydn orchestra begins to look very much like the orchestra we would easily recognize today. So now we have orchestras, we're back up, we left Haydn, and we come to, oh no, the second great dying, which is the end of the great era of Cremonese violin making and the end of the Baroque violin. This happens in the 1730s, 1740s. All the great violin makers of Cremona pass away within 10 or 12 years of each other. The last of the Amati family, the Guarneris, the Stradivaris, Rogeris, all of them. And just what's left are people who are just copying instruments. And it's also the end of the Baroque violin and the birth of the modern violin. As we're going to get into now what I call the age of standardization. And this is what the instruments looked like before this period of time. This is very, very easy to date this. It's just about 1800 to 1810. The Baroque violin, you see, has a relatively thick neck. You're a violin player, you see where your thumb would go down at the thumb stop near the body, how much thicker that is than it is on our modern violin. And that's because the neck was fixed with nails at the time. So it had to be thick. One, because you didn't want to bloody the player's thumb, and the other, if it was too thin, when you drove the nail in, it would split the wood. You'll see that there's a dashed red line at the top of the scroll moving if you look from left to right, and you see how that line aligns with the black line of the joint between the ribs and the top. But to get the strings up high enough over the bridge, they had to put a big wedge underneath the fingerboard. And that makes, as you look at it, it's a very thick and very clumsy assembly. But it didn't make much difference in the early days because nobody was writing parts that made the player play up that high. But it didn't take long. It was even the 1700s, you see parts written for the violin up to the octave E. And so something had to change. And the modern violin, below it, you see the neck is now tilted back, that same dashed red line. That doesn't follow the line of the instrument assembly anymore. It points upwards towards the top of the bridge. And by tilting that back, they can put a very thin, much lighter and stronger and longer fingerboard so that the player can play even higher and higher notes. And to do this, also the necks were lengthened. The necks actually sawed the scroll off the neck, took the old neck out, made a new neck, grafted the old scroll to it, and reset it. And you would be hard pressed to find an instrument coming from those years that has not had this alteration. It was once considered an extremely usual repair. The apprentices in the shops did it. Today it's considered very delicate and a very extremely a pair of repair for experts to do, because the instruments are now worth so much money that they have to be handled with a lot of care. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on bows, and I'm not, but you obviously can't play the violin or the cello without the bow. So the first bow at the top is what you call a Baroque bow, and it's very much, if you remember the picture of the rebec and the vihuelas, that's pretty much looks like the same type of bow. It tapers down at the tip. It's very light. It can be held a number of different ways. The one in the center is what you would call a transitional bow. You'll see that the frog has changed. There's now silver winding where the fingers go, and the head is getting heavier. And then the bottom is pretty much our modern bow. See the thick stick is thicker, head is heavier. And this is because of the demands of modern playing require much more power, and the bow had to be stronger. So the bow evolution followed along, and now we have the downward curve of the bow instead of the upward curve. Of course, instruments came in so many different sizes and shapes that players had to learn the best way to hold them. We trust that this never happened to any of you, but any of us who have been involved in public school music may have had a similar frightening experience. Big jump now. This is the modern orchestra. This, I think, is Chicago. And it is the title up there, The Age of Uniformity. That's not a recognized label. I made that myself. And I wanted to just have you look at this for a moment about the age of uniformity. By this time, all that activity in the size, the instruments are now pretty standardized in size. You see all the violins pretty much look the same, all the cellos look the same, the basses, everything, they're all the same size. And you see that the orchestra, they're all dressed the same. They'll all bow their passages the same way. The string players will all finger the passages the same way. It's the age of uniformity. And what you get from this uniformity is a concert in the sense of a concerted effort by a group of players to kind of put their free will aside for an hour or two and just play with their colleagues and just as one large organic group. And I myself, I look at this picture and I just love this stuff. You know, when game day comes for our orchestra and I put my tuxedo on and my tie, I just can't wait. I mean, to me, this is what orchestras are all about. And what I get out of it is that I know, because of my cooperation and because I'm trying to kind of be as one with the group, I will be able to take part in producing something as a whole that's going to be much greater than I could ever produce by myself. But there's a downside to this too. This age of uniformity really does, it stifles innovation. It stifles creation. It pretty much, you don't ever get out of sync with the rest of your group. In my profession, I have seen players reject a perfectly fine violin because it was too red, or it wasn't red enough. It looked different than the other violins in the section. And if they took that violin, the conductor would ask them not to bring it. So I think we're kind of pushed this almost to the breaking point. And it not only happens in the orchestra, but it happens in the violin too. What happens to the violin now is the instrument from about 1800, when all the neck grafts were done and all the Baroque setup was discarded in favor of the modern setup. The violin is now considered a perfected instrument, an instrument that cannot be improved. And once again, any maker who wants to make something a little out of the ordinary will find that he can't sell the instrument. Most people won't buy it. And I personally will find that very, very frustrating. And the other thing that happens at this time, and I didn't have a slide for this, because how do you make a slide of World War II? But World War II had an absolutely devastating influence on music and musicians and instruments in Europe. Europe pretty much was bombed flat between 1943 and 1945. Great stores of wood for musical instruments, some of it which had been seasoning for 2 generations. It was lost. It was burned up. People, burned it to keep warm if they couldn't. Once they had burned a time, all the schools of violin making, bow making, a lot of other ancient arts were also closing down. And my teacher said one of the reasons was that the post-war period, manpower was very short in Europe, and anybody who wanted to become a violin maker quickly found out that you could make 2 to 3 times as much money at a rebuilding project or working on one of the Allied armies in Europe than you could make as a violin maker. So the stagnation in the business was so bad that in the early 1970s, which is when I got into it, it was considered a dying art. The factories were starting to ramp up. The Asians hadn't really gotten into the act yet, but there seemed to be enough old Italian violins around for anybody who wanted one. And the new ones, the demand for other lesser priced violins was being satisfied by machines or shop workers who were paid by the piece. So the situation was looking pretty dire. And I can tell you, I spent quite a bit of time trying to find someone to teach me how to make a violin. And I did. This will be my last 2 on the slide here. This is my teacher, Karl Roy, on the left. He's a German Geigenbaumeister, head of the Mittenwald Bavarian State School for Violin Making in Mittenwald, a traditionalist. And he had the idea one summer that it would be nice to visit the United States, teach a little week or 2 course at the University of New Hampshire, and then spend the rest of his vacation, 4 more weeks, sightseeing. Little did he know who was waiting for him. When the word got out that he was teaching, the people came pouring. You wouldn't believe the people. He stayed for 16 years at the University of New Hampshire, well, 16 summers. And I stayed with him the whole time. And I learned about the traditional aspects of violin making as it was back in the days of the great master. Also, on the right-hand side, my other teacher, Carleen Hutchins, also was concerned about the status of the violin, but she did not buy into the idea that it was a perfected instrument. You can see in this photo, this is, I think it must be a viola back. She's very well known for her viola. It's hung on 4 rubber bands, and you can see what looks like a microphone stand in front of it. It actually has a little speaker on it, and she is feeding a sine wave into the wood and then measuring the response of the plate. That's what the top and back of the instrument is called when it's not mounted on the ribs. And she worked out ways to discover scientifically what it was the old masters did intuitively to make a really fine sounding violin. And the thing about both of these individuals, and they would be horrified to know that their pictures were on the same page because they had such different views about the subject. But the thing about them is that they taught anybody who came. There was no guild, no apprentice, no secrets. If you were willing to come and you were willing to work, they were willing to teach you. And I just happened to be there at the time. And they were largely responsible for turning that whole decline of the violin world around. Today, the level of violin making probably has never been higher. I tell people that the best violins that have ever been made are probably being made today. And these two folks and others like them were the ones who helped do that. The Violin Society of America is a thriving group with hundreds and hundreds of members. And all in normal times, school music programs would be benefiting even on the least expensive instruments. So that brings us up to today with the end of the violin. And one more slide. And I'm done. Now, I don't know, should I unshare my screen, Julia? Are we going to do questions? I can't even remember how long I've been talking, probably too long.
Why don't you unshare the screen, and then if people have questions, then we'll be able to all see each other.
Stop share.
Stop share.
Whoa,
and I'm going to take your spotlight off.
Hey, Bob, I do have a question because I took
Yes, please.
An advanced music theory class from a composer probably not that well known named John Boda when I was at Florida State in music. And he was a great advocate of the idea that you should get rid of the viola altogether, that the string section should be first and second violin, first and second cello, and contrabass. How much attention did that ever get? How many advocates of that have you ever heard of?
I'm not aware of any, John. I would really disagree with that.
I did.
Yeah, good for you. You know, back when quintet writing for strings was the norm. So you have your brass quintet and you have your woodwind quintet. And at one time, string quintet writing, I mean, even Beethoven, when he was studying composition, that was still required of young composers to learn quintet writing. But the quintets were interesting. Boccherini's quintets call for 2 violins, a viola, and 2 cellos. The standard quartet used in most of Europe calls for 2 violins, 2 violas, and 1 cello. But in France, for a long time, the quintet was 1 violin, 3 violas, and a cello. And I wish we had recordings. I just love to hear what that sounds like. Yeah, I would say that we would do well in the musical world to replace some of these lost instruments. What they do, I've conducted orchestras that have had tenor violins and big altos and little piccolos that play an octave above. And after you've heard that, it's tough to go back.
Hey Bob, I have a question.
Stephen, yes.
Yeah, so these days, like I feel like a lot of like top modern makers have like very like high quality or like very consistently unique sounds. So like I was wondering like how they're able to achieve that. Is it like are they like doing modifications on the pattern or arching, or are they like really good at like plate tuning? Like how does that work?
Well, if you do something long enough, you tend to get good at it. And some makers just naturally gifted and intuitive, and they manage to make a consistent violin. But a lot of makers are using the techniques developed by Carleen Hutchins that I just sort of alluded to there right at the end. And if we do a couple more of these, I will go into that more deeply, and I will actually show you what you do with the violin and what it looks like when it's apart and how it vibrates, and what the things that a maker can control about the sound of the violin and at the end, and the things that he can't. So it's, I spent my whole life trying to understand this, but I'll explain it then as simply as I can.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, I was interested in what you said about the origin of the orchestra, and maybe I missed it, but are you suggesting that it was Greece that gave the idea of the orchestra, or did I misunderstand
Oh,
you?
maybe I didn't explain it clearly. They gave us the terminology.
Okay.
The word orchestra comes from the ancient Greek theaters. And at some point, and no one knows exactly when, the name of the place began to be used on the people who actually performed in that place. Instead, they began to be called the orchestra. But again, it's like many of those old historical facts that you can't go back and find one single point and say, aha, yes, here, this is the first time that ever happened. It just woke up one morning and everyone's saying, oh, they're called an orchestra. I wondered what they were called.
So do you know where the first orchestra was located?
I would say that it's probably the French. But it wasn't an orchestra with woodwinds and brass. It was a full string orchestra. And then music history is not my super strong point, but as you get on to Stamitz and some of these other composers, you can see this evolution taking place. And certainly by the time of Haydn and Mozart, the orchestra is pretty well settled. And for example, talking about the age of uniformity, we had a great modern set of instruments, saxophone instruments, that were developed. It's been, 100 years? I forget when Adolphe Sax invented them, but you hardly ever see them. Only very recently will you see composers writing for saxophones in the orchestra. So things in our world move real slowly.
Okay.
I hope I have not confused you all too badly. Some of you actually still look like your minds are working.
I think this was very interesting. I had no idea how many different string instruments ended up getting condensed to what we have now. I thought that was really like that. Your diagram of that was really extremely interesting. I had no idea that that was the case.
Yeah, it's all I could fit on the screen. It's actually worse than it looks, the instruments that we lost. Maybe some of them weren't really worth saving, or some of them were before their time, Julia. There just wasn't a string strong enough to tune up. I mean, even Bach, and Bach, by the way, a lot of this happened in Bach's lifetime, and he absolutely hated it. He didn't care for the Stile Galant or any of the light writing. He was a master polyphonist. And he actually was instrumental himself, and he commissioned what we would call a tenor instrument, a large tenor instrument, and also a soprano violin, which was to be the instrument a fourth above or an octave above the viola. But I think he even wrote some music for it, but the most they could get it up would to be, I think, either a minor or a major third above the violin, because the strings kept breaking. The technology just wasn't there, and then so it just faded away. Now we have strings that will easily handle that. So perhaps you never know one day. It's been my goal in life.
Well, I'm going to stop the live stream.
Okay, yes, please put me out of my mercy.